This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today, while the ceasefire takes hold in Gaza, we consider the long-term effects of 2 years of war. In Assisi in Italy, we meet the pilgrims queuing to pay their respects to the first millennial saint. In Haiti, we hear how criminal gangs are still in control of the capital, Port-au-Prince. And finally, many people around the world embrace their Irish heritage and dream of a return home. We're on the south coast of Ireland to hear more about the allure of the Emerald Isle. But first, President Donald Trump received a hero's welcome when he landed in Israel this week, following his central role in brokering the Gaza ceasefire and hostage exchange. During his whirlwind trip, he also flew to the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh, where he declared an historical turning point to the gathered world leaders. Mr. Trump even suggested everlasting peace in the region, though was short on detail on just how that might proceed over the coming weeks, months and years. Our US State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman, was on board Air Force One with the president as he flew into Tel Aviv.
If journalism is a front row seat to history, I got 3,000 years of it this week as the BBC's turn came up for a seat on Air Force One. President Trump was proclaiming an end to war after 3 millennia in the world's most combustible region. With that characteristically vivid overstatement, we set out on a journey that turned out to be a diplomatic tornado. I had 24 hours up close to the leader declaring, as the giant billboard above him in Egypt proclaimed, peace in the Middle East. The trip started with what the White House calls a gaggle, a mini press conference on the fly, as Mr. Trump came to the back of the plane to talk to us, the press. Every country is dancing in the streets, he said of the hostage and prisoner exchange he brokered between Israel and Hamas. I pressed him on whether the ceasefire in Gaza would hold. He was confident it would. But he glossed over the really big questions about what comes next, how to secure and govern the territory. As we barreled towards Tel Aviv, Air Force One did a flyby of the beach. It dipped a wing so we could get a view of a giant mural painted on the ground saying thank you to Trump, a picture of his profile and the Israeli flag. The manoeuvre set the mood. This was a victory lap, more than negotiations over Phase 2 for Gaza's future. In Israel, the motorcade zoomed to Jerusalem. As hostages held by Hamas were being exchanged for Palestinian prisoners who'd been held in Israeli jails, tears of relief broke out among anxious families. In the Israeli parliament, the mood was raucous. Spectators shouted from the gallery behind me, "Thank you, Trump," as he entered. Lawmakers hammered their desks. He hailed a historic dawn and expected it to stay that way. Israel, he told them, had won all it could by force of arms. As Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu watched on, there was only one man in charge here. Mr. Trump gestured to Israel's President Isaac Herzog and told him he should pardon Mr. Netanyahu, who is on trial accused of taking bribes and luxury gifts, which he denies. "Cigars and champagne," exclaimed Trump dismissively. Who the hell cares about that? President Trump is a person who seems to think in pictures, in preference to words. The details involved in ending decades of intractable conflict, military occupation, and spirals of attacks and revenge seem to preoccupy him less than what it will look like. Peace, as he sees it, is an image, one of gleaming oceanside towers, lives saved, and him being presented the Nobel Peace Prize. Later on, as we boarded the plane again, this time for Egypt, I pressed him on whether he was proclaiming peace for this entire region prematurely. I sensed the question irritated him, and he threw it back at me, saying I was suggesting more people should die. What do you want? Another 300,000-400,000 people to be killed? Is that what you're looking for? No, this would work, he argued, because he had real power and wealth on his side in the form of the Gulf Arab leaders. We soon descended towards Sharm el-Sheikh, where Egyptian F-16s escorted us into land. They were so close I could see the fighter pilots moving in their cockpits, the ultimate show for the president who loves displays of military might. On the ground next to President Sisi, Mr. Trump praised the man he once reportedly called his favourite dictator. Shaking hands with the Egyptian leader, he said of Sisi, "This is a very powerful man. They have no crime in Egypt. You put it out before it starts." Egypt has been roundly condemned by rights groups for criminalising dissent and locking up opponents. Mr. Trump's comments were quickly picked up by media in the US, where he has sent National Guard troops into cities, he says, to stem crime. In Sharm, world leaders filled the room for the ultimate picture. They lined up in the background as Mr. Trump took to the podium beneath his Peace in the Middle East slogan. He said it had taken 3,000 years to get here. I reflected on the realities on the ground. Amid today's joyous reunions and fragile truce, there was grief, destruction and distrust, and no agreed plan to secure Gaza. Peace in the Middle East is a vision, but for now Mr. Trump was the only one really seeing it.
Tom Bateman. Next, as the dust settles following the ceasefire agreement, one of the unresolved questions is, what'll happen next? And what are the hopes for a bigger breakthrough in establishing long-term peace between Israelis and Palestinians? Jeremy Bowen reflects on this moment in the decades-long debate and whether there will ever be reconciliation.
History is unavoidable in this part of the world. It lives, breathes, and intrudes into the present in a way that I've rarely seen elsewhere in many years of looking. Before I came back to Jerusalem this time round, I did some texting with my friend Eugene Rogan. He's Professor of Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of Oxford. We exchanged messages about where the 7th of October attacks by Hamas and Israel's response over the last 2 years fit into the long sweep of the conflict. In 1948, Israel won its independence war and created a state. In 1967, Israel captured the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. That meant it controlled all of historic Palestine. Eugene and I agreed that 2023, in its own way, marked as important a turning point in the conflict as 1948 and 67. The last 2 horrific years have stripped it back to its essentials. It comes down to possession of the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. The Israeli government has dropped the careful language that even Benjamin Netanyahu has used in the past about the idea of Palestinian statehood. In a speech in 2009, for the first time, he said he could accept a Palestinian state with conditions, including being demilitarized. Now, the Prime Minister, with the support of most Israelis, according to opinion polls, says repeatedly that Israel will never permit Palestinian independence. Not only would it open itself up to another 7th of October, but also, he says, the land belongs to the Jews. A month ago, Mr. Netanyahu went to Ma'ale Adumim, a Jewish settlement on occupied land just outside Jerusalem that pushes down into the Judean desert towards the Dead Sea. He was there to announce a massive expansion of the settlement, and he said once again that there will never be a Palestinian state. This place is ours. If Israel keeps all the occupied territories, it also keeps the Palestinians that live there who want freedom. That wouldn't just continue and most likely deepen the conflict. It would also increase the accusations that Israel denies, made by leading human rights groups, among others, that Israel has imposed a system of apartheid on Palestinians. The Gaza ceasefire has already looked rocky, but let's say it sticks and the war really is over. The consequences of 2023, 24 and 25 will roll on for many more years. Palestinians in Gaza face another generation of struggle to rebuild their lives and homes. That's assuming there is not a new, lower level, but still disastrous war. The systems of governance and security laid out in Donald Trump's Gaza plan have not been established. Hamas says it will not disarm, despite threats from President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And there are the precedents of the past. Many of the Palestinians who took part in aircraft hijacks and joined armed groups to fight Israel in the late 1960s and early 70s were children when their families fled from their homes or were forced out at gunpoint by Israeli troops in 1948. Palestinians call Israel's victory that year the catastrophe. Young Palestinians today who've seen the mass killing of their families and friends and the destruction of their towns need to be offered a better and fairer future. If that doesn't happen, it's easy to see how they might end up as recruits to groups looking for revenge against Israel. I made that point to some Israeli reservists earlier in the war. They were graduate students in their 20s on a brief break before their next combat deployment with the IDF in Gaza. Never mind radicalizing the Palestinians, one of them said, they radicalized us. He said that back on the 6th of October 2023, he'd probably have supported the two-state solution, but after what happened the next day, the killing and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October, he was against it. Israel faces legal consequences. The arrest warrants for war crimes issued by the International Criminal Court against Mr. Netanyahu and his former defense minister Yoav Gallant still stand. The ICC also issued warrants against Hamas leaders, all of whom have since been killed by Israel. And there's the case accusing Israel of genocide at the International Court of Justice. The ICJ has already issued advice that the entire Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, Gaza, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is illegal. Israel will continue to deny all the accusations made about the way it fought the war in Gaza. But the war has left it isolated, more dependent than ever on the United States. And here's one more consequence of 2023. Israel, Palestine, and the rest of us are in a new era, whether we like it or not.
Jeremy Byrne. Next to Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, where the grip of criminal gangs remains as tight as ever on the city's impoverished neighbourhoods. This week, Doctors Without Borders, an organisation which routinely works in some of the world's most dangerous places, announced it was closing an emergency clinic because repeated gunfire and attacks on staff made it too risky to go on, calling the decision a last resort. On a recent visit, Jasmine Dyer saw some of the ruined lives and homes which the gangs have left in their wake.
Market stalls selling clothes and SIM cards line Port-au-Prince's streets. For a city so gripped by violence, it's bustling. Schoolgirls, immaculately dressed with ribbons in their hair, make their way home in the intense heat of the day. The risk to life here is ever present, but here, in contrast to elsewhere, life goes on as best as possible. Our armoured four-wheel drive weaves slowly through the rush hour traffic. With so many areas of Haiti's capital in ruins, the viable routes are always congested. We're on our way to Delmas 30, a neighbourhood that was once home to thousands and now lies deserted. One morning in late February, gangs attacked at dawn, ambushing residents as they slept. Rape, murder, arson, there was no limit to the horror they inflicted on their fellow Haitians. We pull up beside an abandoned supermarket to meet a group of vigilantes, civilians who are filling the security vacuum. Heavily armed, they patrol the deserted neighbourhood, trying to keep the gangs from taking control. We're introduced to Rodrigue, a man in his 60s. He's a tailor by trade. He's going back to see what's left of his home, visiting for the first time since February, and is taking us with him. We make our way through a maze of narrow alleyways. There are almost no signs of life. The neighbourhood is lined with houses blackened by fire and reduced to rubble. We run every time we reach an open space, so we're not spotted by the gangs who are positioned about 2 blocks away. After a tense 10-minute walk, we finally reach what was once Rodrigue's family home. Crumbled concrete and charred sheets of corrugated metal make it impossible to gain entry. He is bereft as he gestures towards what was once a bedroom. "This was my bedroom. That's the kids' room," he explains. "There were so many victims. People were hacked to death," he says. "They carried them out in wheelbarrows." Suddenly a gunshot rings out and the mood shifts. The vigilantes tell us it's their snipers firing warning shots. We don our helmets and decide to leave, concerned that the gangs may retaliate. Over 1 million people are now displaced in Haiti, forced to flee their homes, but it's women and children who are suffering most. 1 in 5 victims of sexual violence here is a child, and women are now reporting instances of gang rape involving multiple assailants. We make our way to a safe house across town. It's home to dozens of young women and girls. Nestled behind high walls, it is purposefully discreet. It seems quiet and peaceful here, but the gangs are never far away in a city where they now control about 90% of the territory. The house is big and open plan. The only man here works as the cook. He smiles and waves at us. Up the stairs we catch a glimpse of the bedrooms. They're sparsely decorated, with bunk beds and bright painted walls. The victims of the violence now living here are shockingly young. A girl in a blue polka dot dress dances on the balcony with her fellow residents. At 12 years old, she is slight and appears younger than her age because of malnutrition. She is the youngest survivor of rape at the house. The eldest is just 19 and tells us she was abducted by the gangs when she was 17 years old. "They raped and beat me," she says, speaking barely above a whisper. When she fell pregnant, the gang told her to have an abortion, and she refused. After being held for over 2 months, she escaped while they were fighting. Her baby daughter is almost 1 and lies asleep in her lap. And yet, despite her devastating ordeal, she is not an outlier or an anomaly. Sexual violence of the most depraved kind is a fact of life for the women of Port-au-Prince. What does the future hold for those seeking refuge within these walls, in a city where violence is both inescapable and unpredictable? This young woman and her baby daughter are 2 of the luckier ones. For now, they have a place to stay, where trained care workers support them. Thousands of others languish in camps where disease and malnutrition run rampant, longing for a life of peace, and not just survival.
Jasmine Dyer.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Last month, in a ceremony presided over by Pope Leo, a London-born boy became the first millennial saint. Carlo Acutis died of leukemia, aged just 15, but in his short life, spent mainly in Italy, he built websites documenting miracles as a means of spreading Catholic teaching, and as a result became known as God's influencer. Isabella Redmayne travelled to the Italian hilltop town of Assisi, where the young saint's body lies, where she met gathering pilgrims.
The miracles aren't as good as they used to be. I'm standing outside the Cathedral of San Rufino in Assisi, central Italy. Inside is the heart of St. Carlo Acutis, the first millennial saint, who was recently canonised. It's midday. The September sun cuts mercilessly into the limestone courtyard, and, Voicing this sad pronouncement on the state of modern Catholicism, a middle-aged woman frowns at me through her sunglasses. She's a pilgrim, one of the thousands who've already journeyed to Assisi to visit the new saint. "They're all second-hand," she says. "No stigmata, no visions. He's not, raised..." She holds out her hand to mime a saint, reanimating a corpse. As a young teenager, Acutis built a website cataloguing miracles. Prospective saints must be responsible for at least 2 of their own. In 2013, 7 years after Acutis himself died from leukemia, age 15, a Brazilian boy suffering from a pancreatic defect claims to have been cured after kissing a relic of Carlo's clothing. In 2022, a Costa Rican student experienced a near-fatal brain hemorrhage. Her mother said she prayed to Carlo, and her daughter was reported to have recovered later that day. Thus, St. Carlo was canonised on the 7th of September, after a 2-decade-long campaign. This is lightning speed by normal standards. The process can take centuries. Carlo's journey to sainthood involved countless Vatican interviews and examinations of his personal effects to determine whether his life exemplified heroic virtue. The required administration, travel, and medical and theological consultations can drive costs into the hundreds of thousands of euros, usually raised by the Catholic community. The Acutis family paid it all themselves. "It doesn't mean he wasn't deserving," says the pilgrim, who had bemoaned the state of modern miracles. Her mouth forms a thin line. "If you could, you would, you know?" Carlo was born in London and grew up in Milan, the child of an insurance broker and a publishing heiress. His family had live-in staff, 2 of whom Acutis converted to Catholicism. They spent their holidays in Assisi, where he requested to be buried. More than 620,000 people visited his tomb in the first 8 months of 2025. Leaving the courtyard, I bump into an Australian family. They say they're not part of the Acutis tourist boom. "We're not religious," confesses the oldest daughter sheepishly. Her mother is more forthright. "We're curious." I tell them what I know about Acutis. "But what did he do?" asks the father. For a moment, I'm stumped. Acutis has been called God's influencer and the patron saint of the internet. Aside from a kind personality, he's best known for his websites. It's not quite up to Assisi's St. Francis, who saw visions, communicated with animals, and founded the Franciscan order. Perhaps his tomb will hold some answers. Outside the church of Santa Maria Maggiore, visitors are corralled into a queue. We move quickly, but not quickly enough for some. A woman keeps nudging me in the back. I wonder if she's signalling superior devotion, then she muscles past to join her friends. The man who replaces her is more relaxed. He's watching the football on his phone. Inside, earthquakes have destroyed most of the fresco's distinguishing features. A pair of giant, disembodied legs loom over a golden statue of the Virgin Mary. One woman trails her hand over its toes, not glancing up from WhatsApp. At the back of the church, a hush descends. No one is texting here. St. Carlo lies encased in glass and stone, hands preserved, face covered by a lifelike silicone mask. He appears relaxed, wearing Nike sneakers and the jumper and jeans he often used to wear, replicated on merchandise for sale around the city. Worshippers kiss the tomb. Droves of people press around his body, searching for solace. Some leave tightly folded notes. I wonder what happens to them, and who clears them away. Outside, I chat to a young Brazilian woman. She came to Italy to watch her brother play in a football tournament. The 2 of them are taking a few days between matches to visit the young saint. "He makes sainthood seem possible," she tells me. "Like, we can do that too. We've never had a saint in modern clothes." She shrugs, smiling. "We wanted to see him." It's as though she's describing popping in to visit a relative. It's a familiarity hard to imagine with any other saint. Acutis' characterization as God's influencer starts to make sense. Influencers sell familiarity. They show us their lives. Today, you can watch St. Carlo videos on YouTube, Google an interview with his mother, and read Facebook posts about him chuckling over The Simpsons. His unremarkableness is the point. He's a boy anyone can know. Many feel he is close to them and close to God. Perhaps this is miracle enough.
Isabella Redmayne. And finally, it's perhaps a bit of a cliché when you travel to the US for locals to boast of their ancestry, part English, part German, part Scots, and more often than not, part Irish. The long-standing romantic allure of Ireland has led many with Irish heritage to long for a return to their ancestral homeland, and in many cases seek to acquire its powerful passport. On a recent visit to Ireland's south coast, James Helm bumped into some transatlantic travellers and heard more about the country's enduring international appeal.
The view towards the Atlantic Ocean from my lush green hilltop was worth the effort to get there. I'd clambered up the steep steps to reach the remnants of a Bronze Age fort. The clouds had finally parted, and the sun turned the sea below from grey to glorious blue. The rolling fields and scattered farms stopped at dark, rocky outcrops where the endless ocean began. Behind me I heard voices, and I fell into conversation with a couple over from the US, a man and a woman, maybe in their early 50s, tall and smartly dressed. He was of Irish descent, he proudly told me in an American accent, over from the West Coast for a vacation to visit family here, and also to take a look at some local properties, with an eye to buying a place where they might spend a few months a year. Two of his relatives were with them, a friendly older couple who pointed across to a valley nearby where they lived. I got two different senses of home, both of them strong. For the older couple, a lived-in and familiar reality. For their younger relative, from thousands of miles away across this great ocean and a continent, this was a place of heritage and attachment, for whom, if a suitable house was found, the bonds were about to become tighter. A few miles away, down the narrowest country lanes, lined with bright fuchsia, I went for lunch in Castle Townsend, a handsome little town with a steep main street running right down to the harbour. Mary Ann's bar, with its low-beamed ceilings and dark front room, was surprisingly busy. There I heard many more American voices, a group of a dozen or so, finishing their meal, settling the bill, and heading back to work outside. This was no busload of day-trippers, but a real slice of Hollywood. They were an advance party, the bar staff explained, preparing to shoot a film about the life of American actor James Stewart. An even bigger crew would soon descend for the filming itself. Great news for a country pub as the summer season was ending. Often, the barman told me as my own lunch arrived on the table, the American visitors who come this way are those who are trying to track down their family ties and ancestral homes. That link with Ireland, the home country, is as strong as ever for many of the Irish diaspora, scattered around the world throughout an often painful history. What then beckons them back? Well, this southwestern corner of the island of Ireland is beguilingly beautiful, and the Irish welcome, of course, is justifiably famed. But it's much more than that. There are blood ties, the desire to explore origins and heritage, and to retrace the steps of ancestors, perhaps to find familiarity and certainty in an uncertain world. I was staying with a friend, Simon, himself back from London, but who spent much of his childhood around here. He had restored a lovely old place in West Cork in a rural area where his family, many of them farmers, goes back generations. He told me how he loves the landscape here, its contours and its colours. The sense of home is much more than that for him, though. He believes the Irish like to place each other and have a particular interest in families attached to a place over time. In one form or another, he said, you often get asked in Ireland who you are and who your people are. Being able to place your family and yourself helps provide a strong sense of identity, something I had watched myself as an outsider living here. I saw music legends Oasis play a huge and euphoric gig up the road in Dublin, Ireland's capital. Coming off the car ferry and about to cross the bridge over the River Liffey, the two Gallagher brothers, Noel and Liam, born in Manchester to Irish parents, looked down at me from a roadside poster. Welcome home, it read. And this past summer, other famous musicians, Ed Sheeran and Billie Eilish, also talked about their own Irish family links. I'm from the northeast of England, but lived in Dublin as BBC correspondent for many years, with two of our sons born there. It's a place I love, and Irish friends extend their welcome home to me whenever I return. In Ireland, going away, as many of the sons and daughters of my friends still do to start jobs and make their lives, has happened over centuries. So too then has going home, to the familiar and the meaningful. That can mean visiting loved ones in a familiar place, or playing music to adoring crowds, or, for some, buying a second home back amongst relatives in a beautiful spot beside the ocean.
James Helm, and that's all for today, but you can hear more dispatches from around the world on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. Today we're in rural Australia, where the media circus has finally left town after a murder trial gripped the nation and the world. In Bolivia, we hear the clever ways in which people are navigating the country's economic crisis. In Kenya, youth-led protests over a lack of jobs turned deadly this week as the president issued a warning to political rivals. And finally, good news from the beehive state of Utah, where an altogether bigger beast is thriving as near-extinct condors fly high once again. But first, to southwest China, home to a long-standing Tibetan resistance movement. While Beijing views Tibet as an integral part of China, the allegiances of many Tibetans lie with its exiled spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama. His followers see him as a living god, though Beijing views him as a separatist threat. Our China correspondent Laura Bicker went to the town of Aba in Sichuan province, where she visited a monastery challenging the restrictions despite heavy surveillance.
The monk walked towards me, shrouded in his crimson robes and moving his prayer beads rhythmically through his fingers. He's made a risky decision. We're being watched by 8 unidentified men. Even saying a few words to me in public could get him in trouble. We're in a monastery in the town of Aba, in China's southwestern Sichuan province, which sits outside the official border of the Tibet Autonomous Region, but many Tibetans still consider it part of their homeland. The monastery here has been at the centre of Tibetan resistance for decades. Most of the 150 gruesome self-immolations calling for the return of the Dalai Lama have happened in this town. Things are not good for us, the monk says quietly. They do not have a good heart. Everyone can see it, he adds. By they, he means the Communist Party of China, who've now governed more than 6 million Tibetans for almost 75 years, since it annexed the region in 1950. China has invested heavily in Tibet, building new roads and railways. But it also wants to make Tibetan Buddhism more Chinese. It's labelled Tibet's exiled spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, as a dangerous separatist, and those who display his image or offer him support could end up behind bars. The monk has a final warning before he leaves. "Be careful, they're watching you," he says, while walking off as the men tailing us come running. To find out why so many here still resist Chinese rule, the next day before dawn, we hiked past our minders to head to morning prayers. The monks gathered in their yellow hats, a symbol of the Gelug school of Buddhism. A wave of low, sonorous chanting resonated through the hall as ritual smoke offerings lingered in the still and humid air. Around 30 local men and women, most in traditional Tibetan long-sleeved jackets, sat cross-legged as a small bell chimed to end the prayer. "The Chinese government has poisoned the air of Tibet," one monk told us. "We Tibetans are denied basic human rights. The Chinese government continues to oppress us and persecute us," he continues. He gave no details, and our conversations were brief to avoid detection. But it's so rare to hear these voices. Even getting to Aba can be challenging. The road here winds slowly for around 300 miles from the Sichuan capital of Chengdu. It passes through snow-packed peaks, eventually reaching an expanse of rolling grassland at the edge of the Himalayan plateau. The gold sloping rooftops of Buddhist temples shimmer every few miles as they catch the intense high-altitude sunlight. This is the roof of the world, where traffic gives way to yak herders on horseback who whistle to reluctant, grunting cattle, and eagles circle above the herd towards clouds which build to cover the afternoon sun. But there are two worlds underneath this Himalayan sky, where heritage and religion have collided with the party's hopes of unity and control. Surveillance is more pervasive here than in the rest of China. A simple hotel check-in requires facial recognition. Even buying petrol requires several forms of identification, which are shown to high-definition cameras. Monks told us they're concerned Tibetan culture is being eroded, as all under-18s must now attend state school and learn Mandarin. And yet the road to Aba also highlights Beijing's efforts to invest in this remote part of the world. A new high-speed railway line hugs the hills, linking Sichuan province with others on the Himalayan plateau. The traditional high street shops selling monk robes and large bundles of incense for the monasteries now sit alongside new hotels, cafes and restaurants to entice tourists to the area. Beijing also believes it's teaching Tibetan children Mandarin to give them a better chance at getting a job. A party slogan written on the roadside boasts that people of all ethnic groups in China are united as closely as pomegranate seeds. As we leave the monastery, a line of ladies, most of them over 50 years old, walk through the room of prayer wheels, spinning them clockwise. They sing in Tibetan and smile as they pass. Some carry heavy baskets on their backs, filled with tools ready for construction or farming work. Their greying, pleated hair only just visible under their sun hats. Now 90 years old, the Dalai Lama has announced to his followers that his office will appoint a successor after his death. Beijing refutes this and says only it has the power to choose the next Dalai Lama. Since the 1950s, Tibetans have tried to cling on to their identity, fought for it, and here in Aba, some have died for it. The challenge now will be to protect it, even when the leader who embodies their beliefs and their resistance is no longer around.
Laura Bicker. Next to Kenya, where a year on since Gen Z protesters led a wave of demonstrations against controversial tax rises, a new wave of protests has erupted and once again turned deadly. The UN accused Kenyan police of using excessive force in their response to this week's demos. 31 people were killed on Monday and more than 500 were arrested, according to a Kenyan human rights group. President William Ruto has defended the police action, though the government's economic challenges continue to fan anger in a country where youth unemployment is stubbornly high. Anne Soy has been following the story in Nairobi.
It's not the usual opposition. Kenya's Gen Z protesters are redefining politics in Kenya. Their rallying calls often start on social media, and the current unrest began last year with the hashtag Finance Bill 2024, online opposition to the government's proposals to raise taxes on bread, disposable nappies, and other basic commodities. On TikTok, young tax experts broke down what the controversial plans meant. They hurt the ears of teenagers and young adults just getting to know how governments work. Most of them had never voted, but would soon be eligible, and, crucially, they were engaged like never before. When they took to the streets, they were armed with smartphones, live streaming their confrontations with police, who used tear gas, water cannons, and gunfire to bring the protests under control. The protests culminated in the storming of parliament buildings, which marked a turning point. President Ruto invited young Kenyans to have a conversation, on social media, of course. The taxes were eventually dropped, and President Ruto fired his cabinet. 1 year on, and the president has rehired most of those ministers, but has been careful about raising taxes again. Young Kenyans are as engaged as ever. One young woman developed a website explaining the government's new finance bill. It included a link through which people could send feedback direct to the inboxes of politicians. For that, she was arrested, and public anger was rekindled. The situation boiled over after a teacher and blogger was killed while in police custody earlier this month. He had been arrested for a social media post criticizing a senior police officer. 3 police officers have now been charged with the killing, but protesters had already made the decision to take to the streets once more. This week's demonstrations coincided with the 35th anniversary of the historic Saba Saba, meaning 7-7, protests on the 7th of July 1990, which launched Kenya's push for multi-party democracy. Once again, police used tried and tested methods to quell them, and in the process, more people were killed. To make matters worse, no one has yet been held accountable for the killing of at least 60 people during the protests last year. "You can't kill us," and leaders, cried some protesters who came out to commemorate the dead. On the streets they chanted, "Ruto must go." Another hashtag, one term, meaning one term, quickly gained traction. The majority of young Kenyans do not want to see President Ruto re-elected in 2027. This time round, police have tried to prevent protesters gathering in significant numbers. Every time a group started to gather, I saw how quickly they were tear-gassed. On the 3rd day of protests, Kenyans woke up to find all roads leading to the capital blocked by police. No vehicles were allowed through. The protesters gathered on the outskirts where they engaged in running battles with police all day long. Neighborhoods that had never seen anti-riot police before witnessed the use of tear gas, water cannons, and gunfire for the first time. A man watching on from his balcony was hit by a stray bullet and killed. A 12-year-old girl watching television at home was also hit. She later died in hospital. Her distraught mother vowed to pursue justice, but it will not return our daughter to us, she said as she broke down. Last year, politicians were dismissive of the protesters, adopting a defiant tone, all the while living opulent lives for all to see, flaunting designer watches worth more than their monthly salary, or shoes costing more than the national average wage. They mocked young protesters for what they saw as their own pampered middle-class lives, claiming they came to protest via Uber before heading off for lunch at KFC. The assumption was the young people who had taken to the streets weren't tough enough to endure protesting in the long term. This week's protests have proved them wrong, and they have taken the protesters more seriously. They know that more than 800,000 college graduates are joining Kenya's job market every year, and the opportunities for them only keep shrinking. And now, young, educated and tech-savvy Kenyans are planning on how to change the country's political landscape with the hope of creating a better future.
I'm sorry. Earlier this week, an Australian woman was found guilty of murdering 3 of her relatives and attempting to kill another at a lunch where she served beef Wellington laced with toxic death cap mushrooms. Erin Patterson had invited her in-laws, Don and Gail Patterson, to lunch, along with Gail's sister, Heather Wilkinson, and her husband, Ian. Within days of the meal, 3 of the 4 guests were dead. Katie Watson covered the trial from the start, travelling frequently to the small town of Morwell in rural Victoria, where the court sat.
In a country as massive as Australia, Morwell's hardly remote. There's a fast road from Melbourne, the country's second city, and the connections are good. The drive takes just 2 hours, passing through gently rolling hills and small farming towns. When you arrive in Morwell, though, it's a very different world to the coastal cities where most Australians live. Morwell used to be a thriving industrial town. There was a paper mill and a power station. Both provided hundreds of jobs. The mill, though, made huge cuts, and the power station was also shuttered. It wasn't just a major employer, it was the focal point of the town. It still is, in a way. The landmass of Hazelwood open mine that fed the power station is bigger than Morwell itself, the town attached to a coal mine that's now silent. In Morwell's town centre, there are general stores and a few restaurants. It's the cafes, though, that have had a bit of a revival of late. For the entirety of the trial, every Monday, the judge and the lawyers from both prosecution and defence would make their way from Melbourne to Morwell to spend the week in Court Number 4 of Latrobe Valley Courthouse. Every Friday lunchtime, the court would adjourn and the legal teams would all return to their lives in the big city. What that meant was the weekdays were packed full of temporary residents in Morwell. And as everybody needs their flat whites in the morning in Australia, the coffee of choice here, queues were common, small talk on the latest activities in court inevitable. I don't think there's ever been anything like this, and there may well never be in Morwell ever again, says journalist Liam Durkin, the editor of Latrobe Valley Express, a weekly paper more used to covering community events and local politics than serious crime. The biggest court case Liam had done before this was that of a corrupt politician. It lasted a day. Erin Patterson's murder trial, though, went on for 10 weeks. It was meant to last 5 or 6, but after more than 50 witnesses, piles of evidence, and many a legal argument, the time frame blew out. It created something of a temporary community here, not just journalists covering the case, but also court watchers, lawyers, and security staff at the court. Everyone got to know each other. A few weeks ago, we popped into the daily coffee shop during the court lunch break. Sat in the corner was Erin Patterson's defence team. On the other side of the cafe was the chief police investigator on the case, and in between them, several tables occupied by the dozens of journalists covering the trial. While Morwell isn't used to hosting murder cases in its courts, crime is not unfamiliar here. Everyone tells you as much. Burglaries, youth crime, it's got worse in recent years as jobs have dried up. There were TV crews from Australia and international teams like us, all intrigued by this seemingly bizarre tragedy. An average family, victims who were kind, generous pillars of the community. Erin Patterson, a doting mother of 2 children. What happened? In the absence of an obvious motive, public speculation went into overdrive, and this trial became a global true crime obsession. There are far fewer women who commit murder, says criminologist Santhe Mallet, and if they do it, then poison is the weapon of choice. But it's more than that, she says. Erin Patterson's the first female mass murderer in Australia in recent history. It's got that Macbeth feel to it, she adds. Every day, members of the public, fascinated by the trial, would fill the few remaining seats in the small court not occupied by journalists or members of the victims' families. There were queues on the days when Erin Patterson took the stand. Cases like this are a form of storytelling, where you're trying to make your story more compelling to the jury, says Joanne Stagg, a lecturer at Griffith University Law School. The fact that Erin Patterson gave evidence made that kind of narrative more compelling, she goes on. Despite the gripping nature of this case, the crime mustn't be overlooked. 3 people died, another only just survived. That man, Ian Wilkinson, came to watch the trial every single day, flanked by family members, all quietly taking in the details that came to light. This case has fascinated the world and given people an insight into life in rural Victoria that perhaps few really understood, not even locals. I never thought I'd be listening to fungi experts and the like for weeks on end, but here we are, says journalist Liam Durkin.
We've got an agricultural sector around here, but in my experience, we've never really delved into foraging mushrooms or anything like that. And that's coming from me, who's the son of a potato farmer.
Katie Watson.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Bolivia was once seen as an economic miracle thanks to its huge natural gas reserves. But the energy exports on which the country once thrived have fallen sharply in recent years, pushing many people into poverty. Trust in the government has also fallen, and the country's political future looks uncertain ahead of presidential elections in August. The incumbent, Luis Arce, recently announced he would not be running for a second term, while former President Evo Morales' bid to run for a fourth term was ruled unconstitutional. Carolyn Lamberley reveals how the country's economic woes are now affecting people from all walks of life.
Maria Cristina Martinez is a welcoming woman. She's middle-aged and looks elegant in her summery dress. Her phone keeps buzzing. She runs a small guest house in Sucre, Bolivia's southern historical capital, known for its whitewashed buildings, pristine colonial architecture, and its mild weather. We get chatting, and soon enough, she starts telling me about her financial woes. Bolivia is going through an economic crisis, and it caught up with Maria Cristina last year. Faced with ever-rising costs, she considered scrapping the breakfast she offers at the guest house, but she was scared of losing clients. So instead, Maria Cristina decided to drop just the eggs from the menu. A carton of eggs used to cost around 20 Bolivianos. Now, it's around 35 Bolivianos, she tells me. Maria Cristina says she only pulled through thanks to what's known as pasaneku. Every month, a group of friends or family puts a fixed amount of money into a communal pot, and in rotation, one person takes all the money that's been collected. It's a sort of savings account, Maria Cristina says. This current economic crisis has brought back bad memories for Maria Cristina. She tells me how when she was younger, her grandmother had refused to put her money in the bank, instead keeping all her cash at home. But then hyperinflation hit, and all her savings went up in smoke. After a while, she could only buy 1 kilo of meat with all the money she'd saved up to buy a house, Maria Cristina remembers woefully. This was back in the 80s. Things aren't quite as grim now, but still, people are struggling. And the political division in the country is also making things worse. Supporters of former President Evo Morales, who led the country for 13 years, have been putting up roadblocks across the country. They're protesting against rulings by the constitutional and electoral courts barring Mr. Morales from running for a fourth term this August. But blocking food supplies has pushed prices even higher, and a fuel crisis has compounded the situation. With the election now looming, tensions are at an all-time high, and some demonstrations have turned deadly. Back in Sucre, near the Central Market in downtown, money changers call out to passersby. The gap between the official and black market exchange rates has soared in recent years. This has become commonplace in countries like Argentina, but it's a new trend in Bolivia. These days, business is tough for money changers too, or cambistas as they're known. It goes against logic because, as one tells me, when the price of the dollar goes up and the price of the Boliviano goes down, people usually rush to buy dollars. The idea is to secure your savings in a safer currency, like the dollar, in case the gap keeps growing, like what happened to Maria Cristina's poor grandmother. But there just aren't that many dollars in circulation right now. the money changer tells me. She says she's lost at least half of her business in recent months. A guy comes over to buy dollars, but she's already sold all she had that morning, so he leaves. They say there are no dollars in the bank, another money changer tells me. Central bank data shows that net foreign currency reserves have plummeted over the past 10 years. Many other people I speak to tell me that natural gas exports have dropped dramatically due to declining production and reserves, and that that's the reason for the scarcity in dollars. And yet, despite Bolivian gas exports decreasing, the government kept up spending, one economist, Gonzalo Chavez, told me. We're witnessing the death of the economic model that dominated under Evo Morales and that has been continued by Luis Arce, the current president and former economy minister, he went on. I travel on to La Paz, where I meet Lucy, who runs a juice stand at a market. She says inflation hasn't affected her so much, and that you just need to know how to dig for deals. But she is affected by the roadblocks and all the political drama. She used to support Evo Morales, she tells me, but now she wants him to step aside and give up on his bid to run again. Although he championed indigenous rights and is credited with lifting many people out of poverty, his image has been tarnished by a series of scandals, though he still enjoys support in many parts of the country. Evo, if you're listening to me, stop screwing around, Lucy says defiantly. I ask her who she'll vote for in the election. We'll have to see, she replies, but it has to be a ruler who truly loves our Bolivia.
Carolyn Lamberley. And finally, we're in Utah, in the Zion National Park, where the largest land bird in North America is once again thriving. Back in the 1980s, the Californian condor was at risk of extinction, its numbers plummeting because of illegal hunting, lead poisoning, and the effects of pesticides. Stephen Moss tells the story of the conservation campaign that helped the giant bird make a remarkable comeback.
On a cold, bright day, my son George and I are driving through Zion Canyon. Sandstone cliffs, glowing pink, cream and brick red, contrast with a deep blue sky, like a scene from a western. And then I notice a dark, wonky rectangle high above us. Surely it can't be, but it is. A California condor, one of fewer than 600 living individuals, soaring between a gap in the mountains across the sunlit sky. With birding, timing is everything. I've only got a few seconds before the condor disappears behind the crags, so this could be my last chance to get a proper view. Struggling to undo my seatbelt, I half step, half fall out of the car while raising my binoculars. And yes, the bird is still there. The California condor is a true giant. With a near 10-foot wingspan, it's more likely to be mistaken for a small plane than any other bird. It's also the avian equivalent of Lazarus, having almost literally come back from the dead. Back in the 1980s, there were just 22 condors living in the wild, with this famous raptor predicted to vanish altogether by the turn of the millennium. Something radical had to be done, or the species was doomed. So, on Easter Sunday 1987, the last condors were taken into captivity in a plan to breed the surviving birds in zoos and eventually return them to the wild. To say this was controversial is an understatement. Complaints, protests and lawsuits tried to stop the programme, with some arguing that the millions of dollars it would cost would be better spent on saving other, equally well-deserving species. Even some of those who saw no alternative believed the plan was doomed to fail. And yet, just 4 years later, the first captive-bred birds were released, and they returned to Zion Canyon in 1999. Today, wild condors can be seen across much of their former range, from California to Arizona and Utah to Mexico. The next morning we rise early and head along the canyon to Angel's Landing, a famous landmark beloved by hikers and climbers alike. David, our eagle-eyed guide, soon picks out the unmistakably huge dark outline of a condor perched at the top of the cliff. It's a male, wing-tagged with the figure Z, in American parlance Z, and 0. Moments later, the bird conveniently turns to face the morning sun, showing off his bare head, ruffled neck feathers, yellowish-orange face, and massive,
hooked beak. Even George, usually a reluctant birder, is impressed. We point it out to a group of guys in the car park, one of whom wanders over to chat. By chance, he's Pete Kozalski, a volunteer at Zion, who's been involved with the Condor project ever since the first wild-hatched chick successfully fledged in the park, back in 2019. It's not been an easy journey. One of the 2 young birds born here later died from lead poisoning, as did their father, probably from feeding on a deer shot by local hunters. More recently, the second youngster had to be taken back into captivity and detoxified, again because of lead ammunition. And that's not the only problem threatening the condors. As we gaze up at the cliff, Pete shakes his head in frustration. He's right where he shouldn't be. I'll have to go up tomorrow and shoo him off of there, as he's too close to people. Pete explains that although there are signs advising visitors to stay away from the birds, everybody's got to get their selfie with the condor. These are curious creatures, he tells us, so it's not uncommon for them to land right next to someone. But that's your cue to get up and move. We say our goodbyes and head off to explore the rest of the canyon and its bird life. Later that day, as we board the plane home, I recall that magnificent creature soaring free in the skies above Zion. And I give thanks to those far-sighted visionaries who proved the skeptics wrong and saved the California condor for future generations to enjoy.
Stephen Moss, and that's all for today, but you can hear more stories on the From Our Own Correspondent podcast on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
Hello, my name is Alex von Tunzelman and I want to introduce you to History's Heroes, the BBC's breathtaking, high-stakes, story-led podcast shining a light on extraordinary people and ordinary people who become extraordinary, including a pioneering surgeon who rebuilt the shattered faces of soldiers.
You know, he would look at these men and he would say, "Don't worry, Sonny, you'll have as good a face as any of us when I'm done with you."
And the woman who created the international charity Save the Children. Subscribe to History's Heroes on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This BBC podcast is supported by ads outside the UK.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
Hello. Today we're watching Ukraine from afar as our correspondent tracks the fate of his childhood home as his town came under Russian occupation. Spain reflects on the legacy of General Franco 50 years after his death. In Bangladesh, there's still tension on the streets after the country's former leader was sentenced to death. And we're sailing on a cargo ship across the Black Sea. The Wi-Fi may be pricey, but the journey is made all the more lively thanks to an array of travelling companions, cows included. But first, this week the UN Security Council voted in favour of a US-drafted resolution that endorses Donald Trump's 20-point plan for Gaza. This includes the establishment of an international stabilisation force and an increase in humanitarian aid. Hamas rejected the plan, saying it fails to meet Palestinian rights and demands. The UN has said only a fraction of the aid needed has so far been allowed into Gaza, with the equivalent of 6,000 trucks' worth of supplies currently being stored in Jordan and Egypt. Meanwhile, Jordan has continued to provide medical care for Gazans injured during the conflict. Our correspondent Fergal Keane has been following the story of one young boy who travelled for treatment.
The first time I saw him, Abdul Rahman was smiling. He looked excited. There was so much noise, relentless activity. Helicopters carrying other sick and wounded children were still coming into land. A fleet of ambulances was drawn up on the edge of the airstrip. The boy, 11 years old, moved towards the ambulances with the aid of crutches. He told the Jordanian nurse who travelled with him he'd come to get a new leg. He would return to Gaza to run with his friends again. There were perhaps 20 or so journalists there. What did we look like to the children emerging from the helicopters who had never seen a world outside Gaza? Like people from another world, I thought. Well-fed, well-dressed, unafraid. As a journalist, especially in zones of conflict, I think often about the gulf between my experiences, my history, opportunities, expectations, rights, and those of the people I'm reporting on. I believe there's immense value in trying to mentally stand in their place, not to pretend to be them or patronize them or take sides, but to deepen our understanding, to acknowledge the human link between us. In my experience, it's far harder to do this when you're dealing with children, especially those traumatized by war. How can a 64-year-old man of privilege like myself possibly imagine the world of a young mind harrowed by terrible sights? Over the years, I've learned to move cautiously with the children of war, to listen, to not press a question where I sense it might cause distress. More than anything, it was becoming a father myself that made me open my mind and heart to the suffering of those young lives caught in wars they did not start, over which they have no control. Abdul Rahman's father was killed in an Israeli bombing. His mother Asma told me he was at home, they bombed the house, they brought him out in pieces. Abdul Rahman was maimed by another Israeli airstrike next to the school where he was sheltering with his widowed mother and sister. He'd been selling tea at a small stall to raise money for his family. The child was taken to hospital, where doctors ultimately decided to amputate his leg. Afterwards, his mental state deteriorated, as Asma remembers. He started pulling his hair and hitting himself hard, she said. He became like someone who has depression, seeing his friends playing and running around, and he's sitting alone. I met Abdul Rahman again several weeks after his arrival in Jordan. Jordanian doctors had fitted him with a prosthetic leg. He was doing physiotherapy and vigorously practicing walking without crutches. We spoke in a hospital room where he was practicing playing an oud, a lute-like instrument of the Middle East that is the ancestor to the guitar. A Jordanian colleague gave him the pear-shaped 11-stringed instrument, hoping it might calm the trauma he lived with. The 10th century Palestinian poet Kushajim offers a sense of the emotional power of the instrument. He wrote, "I remembered you as I embraced my oud, with tears racing to my eyes. I clasped it to my chest as we entwined, and wondered how it does not burst into flames when it nears my kindling heart." I play the guitar, and so I asked Abdul Rahman to teach me some of his music. My efforts were tuneless, but they did make him smile. He relaxed. He spoke of going back to Gaza when he'd finished his physiotherapy. "Our home is there," he said. "We live there, and we'll die there." A few weeks later, the family returned. As they were crossing into Gaza, the Israeli Defense Forces searched the vehicle in which they were travelling. They saw the oud and they took it from Abdelrahman, along with some foodstuffs. I asked Israel's Ministry of Defense why they'd done this. In an email, they replied, "Individuals returning to the Gaza Strip are not permitted to bring in their personal luggage, equipment that has not been approved as essential humanitarian aid, and without prior coordination." They also said that the oud had not been confiscated, but sent back across the border to Jordan. Afterwards, Abdelrahman told our local journalist in Gaza that he had been angry, but had managed to quieten himself. In the last images that were sent to me from Gaza, he is fetching water, playing with his little brother, and riding a bicycle around the ruins of his neighbourhood. He has lost his precious oud, but he is a determined child. I feel sure that someday Abdelrahman will find his way to the music that was taken from him.
Fergal Keane. Next to Bangladesh, where this week former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. Prosecutors accused the former leader of being behind hundreds of killings during anti-government protests last year. Ms. Hasina, who's currently living in exile in India, called the verdict biased and politically motivated. Arunaddin Mukherjee has been in the capital, Dhaka.
My tears will only stop when she's brought back to Bangladesh, when I see her executed in front of me. That statement from Abdul Rob really stayed with me. His body was shaking with emotion as he uttered those words. The former delivery van driver even told me that the gallows should be built by Bangladeshis, as he wiped tears from his face. That's the day, he says, justice will truly be served. I'm Indian, but I speak the local language, and you really had to hear his words in Bangla to feel their impact. A man seeking retribution, waiting desperately to see Sheikh Hasina hanged. The woman who until recently had been a near-permanent fixture in Bangladesh's politics, the longest-serving female head of government. Abdul's voice was broken, but his resolve unshaken. His son Miraj was killed in the deadly police crackdown in August last year. He was just 29. It was clear Abdul held Miss Hasina responsible long before the court's verdict. He had been standing outside the court since early that morning, peeping through the gate's grills, waiting anxiously for any news, along with a few other families who had gathered. As Abdul described how he found his son's body, the memories overwhelmed him, and he broke down. His son was among the nearly 1,400 people killed during last year's anti-government protests, which is why the anger against Sheikh Hasina is still palpable among many in the country, especially those who lost a loved one at the hands of the police. The applause that erupted inside the court when the judge read out the death sentence was deafening. Shortly after the ruling, I heard that there had been disturbance brewing in Dhanmondi, a neighborhood in central Dhaka. A local fixer told me a large crowd had gathered near Sheikh Hasina's abandoned family home and wanted to demolish it. Pictures and videos started pouring in on his WhatsApp feed as he shuffled through the clips, one of them sent by a cameraman who we had sent ahead to film the protest. I heard a young girl in the video shout, "We want to destroy any signs that are reminders of the earlier fascist regime." As we drove towards the site of the clashes, I braced myself for tight security all around, people celebrating the verdict on the streets, unruly scenes where large mobs would be trying to erase other memories of Sheikh Hasina. But the shops and offices were open. People were going about their daily lives, and things seemed very normal, including the infamous Dhaka traffic. It made me realize that while Abdul and those protesting were still haunted by the memories of last year's violence, life for many others in the country had moved on. But as we got closer to Sheikh Hasina's old residence, the atmosphere changed sharply. I could see smoke and hear the commotion of a crowd, so we stopped the car a few hundred meters away. I was jolted by the sound of a tear gas shell being fired. Mostly young Bangladeshi men had gathered on both sides of the road, facing off with the police on the other side. They had been stopped as they tried to descend on the home which first belonged to Miss Hasina's late father, who was also the country's first president. Our team was forced to take cover inside a small bakery as the clashes intensified. I could see through the shutters, bricks being thrown and more tear gas shells exploding. The crowd oscillated between charging towards the police and running away from them. Those alongside me in the shop were surprisingly calm while sipping their tea. One of them was shaking his head disapprovingly. "What's the point of this?" he said. just people out to cause nuisance. As things calmed, I walked out. The road was strewn with rocks and shoes, presumably those that had fallen off people's feet while they were running. The scattered protesters looked directionless. Some, I could tell, were out there driven by mob mentality. Others, perhaps, were more committed. We walked back to the car, keeping a lookout for any fresh signs of violence. I couldn't help but wonder what the future holds for this country. Who will fill the political vacuum now that Sheikh Hasina's Awami League, once the biggest party in Bangladesh's politics, lies scattered just like the people on those streets in front of me? The upcoming elections in February will be a chance to start afresh. The Awami League has been barred from participating. Since the ouster of its government, the party has largely been invisible from politics on the ground. All its top leaders are in exile, many of them in India, while others have been arrested. For the country's next leader, the fallout of last year's protests and the subsequent sentencing of Sheikh Hasina will serve as a reminder as to what could happen if they fail to deliver.
Arunade Mukherjee. Next to Ukraine, where, as another winter of war creeps in, Russian attacks on energy infrastructure have increased. Among the targets are the country's nuclear power plants, with Europe's largest located in the southern region of Zaporizhia. The region's main city came under missile attack on Thursday, killing 5. Russian troops have occupied around 3/4 of the region and have been making further gains in recent weeks. Vitaly Shevchenko recounts a recent discovery he made about his childhood home there.
It was another busy day at work. Russian forces had once again attacked my home region of Zaporizhia, a region in the south of Ukraine, split between the Russian invaders and the defending Ukrainians. Sitting in my office in central London, I was feeling nostalgic. Before going home, I decided to take a quick look at the latest satellite images of my childhood village, the poetically titled Verkhnya Krynytsia, or Upper Well in English. It's in the Russian-occupied part of the region, not far from the front line. I could see the familiar dirt tracks and the houses almost drowning in lush vegetation. But something caught my eye and made me stay at my desk a bit longer. Amid all the apparent quiet of that small village I remember so well, a new feature had appeared, a well-used road. And it led right into my childhood home. How curious, I thought. The truth is that my childhood village is not quiet anymore. Verkhnya Krynytsia was occupied by Russia shortly after the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. By that point, my old house was already vacant. My family had sold it long ago, but I visited Verkhnya Krynytsia at least once a year before it was occupied, and saw the house sitting abandoned, its garden overgrown. It was hardly surprising. The village was small and sleepy at the best of times, and for anyone still under retirement age looking for work usually meant moving elsewhere. Before Russia attacked, Verkhnya Krynytsia sat on the beautiful Kakhovka reservoir, which was so vast it stretched beyond the horizon. We used to call it the sea. It's where we went swimming in the summer, and where visitors from across the region came in the winter to go ice fishing. One of my earliest memories is of local women singing Ukrainian folk songs as the sun was setting into the Kakhovka on a warm summer evening. Our orchard was a treasure trove. I remember selling apricots and pears by the bucket load to tourists travelling down the old road which links Moscow and Crimea and which runs past Verkhnya Krynytsia. The village has now changed beyond recognition. The sea disappeared after the Kakhovka Dam was destroyed in June 2023, leading to devastating floods downstream. The road where I used to sell fruit is now used by tanks, not tourists. And yet, my old, previously abandoned home seemed, from the satellite pictures, to have turned into a hive of activity. To find out why, I tried reaching out to locals I still know, but getting answers was very difficult. Many have left, and those who stayed are afraid of speaking to the media. Frontline locations are particularly lawless places, where retribution from Russian forces can be swift and brutal. What used to be a peaceful, sleepy village has turned into a zone of fear. One acquaintance told me that locals preferred to stay indoors because of all the drones. "It's very dangerous here," Our village has changed a lot, Vitaly. So, given the danger and devastation caused to Verkhnya Krynica by the war, who could have possibly made the track marks on the new road leading to and from my old home? It had to be Russian soldiers, I thought. Civilians are keen to leave rather than move in. To check if my hunch was right, that Russian soldiers had moved into my old house, I approached Ukraine's 128th Brigade, which is involved in operations in the area. You are not wrong. It's extremely likely, its spokesman Alexander Kurbatov told me. As locals have been fleeing frontline areas, they are being replaced with Russian military, he said. Nobody I knew in the village wanted to take the risk of taking a closer look at my old house, so I asked my BBC Verify colleague to obtain and analyse recent satellite images. They showed that the dirt road got more use when the weather became colder and wetter, possibly because Russian soldiers found life in trenches unbearable during the harsh Ukrainian winters. I may not find out the truth about what happened to my childhood home and who is now seemingly living there for some time yet. Certainly not while the village is under occupation. For now, it seems likely that it has become a tiny cog in the wider machine of Russia's war in Ukraine.
Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I've got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.
This week, Spain marked the 50th anniversary of the death of Francisco Franco. After his demise in 1975, the dictator was buried in the church of what was known as the Valley of the Fallen, a vast monument built by Franco after the Spanish Civil War. Since the socialists were re-elected in 2018, the government's been determined to redefine the valley, which began with the removal of Franco's body from its resting place back in 2019. Linda Presley recently met the dictator's great-grandson in Madrid.
It's the sound that Francisco Franco y de Suelves can't forget. The grating, laboured soaring through the slab of cold black marble that covered his great-grandfather's tomb. It echoed off the vaults, just heartbreaking for the whole family, he remembers. It took, he says, what seemed like an eternity to remove the casket from where it lay underground behind the altar. Then the dictator's remains were borne by funeral directors to the entrance of the vast church that had been scooped out of a rocky hillside using dynamite and forced labour. Here, family members took over as pallbearers of the immensely heavy zinc coffin enclosed in a further coffin before the portico doors were opened. Outside, the world's press assembled. The cameras clicked and whirred, recording an historic moment for Spain. For Francisco, it was an honour to be one of those carrying his great-grandfather. Finally, the casket was placed inside a helicopter and took off over the valley's giant cross that stretches high into the sky. They call it disinterment, says Franco's great-grandson, whose family had fiercely resisted the government's plans for the removal of the dictator's remains. I call it desecration. Franco's now buried at the cemetery of Mingo Rubio in Madrid, next to his wife. It's here that we meet the younger, very much alive Francisco, who's in his 40s. He's tall and lean, unlike his great-grandfather, and he's standing in front of a grey stone mausoleum the size of a small house. Its outside wall is covered in flowers, religious iconography, pictures of the late dictator and flags, including the banner of the Falange, the Spanish fascist party. All of it left here by members of the public. When we arrive, Francisco tells us he's just been chatting to a family who'd come from Valencia to pay homage to his great-grandfather. Whilst we're at the cemetery, there's a constant stream of visitors who stop to read the tributes, taking pictures, phones in hand. I ask Francisco what he thinks about the government's plans to rethink and explain what was known for decades as the Valley of the Fallen. As part of the Socialist government's 2022 Democratic Memory Law, the valley reverted to its original name of Cuelgamuros, and there are plans to build some kind of museum there, perhaps not unlike Chile's Museum of Memory and Human Rights, that commemorates the victims of Augusto Pinochet's military dictatorship. Francisco thinks the plans are going to be vengeful and one-sided. They want to redefine it, but who are they to do that, he asks. For him, it's a temple of worship. Francisco just doesn't see the Valley of Cuelgamuros as a political monument, built to celebrate the victory of his great-grandfather's nationalists over Republican Spain in the Civil War, as so many Spanish people do. People like Spain's Minister for the Presidency and of Justice, Felix Bolaños. He was born a month after Franco died in 1975, which makes him a few years older than the dictator's great-grandson, and Minister Bolaños was one of 3 socialist government representatives in the valley on that day when Franco's remains were exhumed, the deafening sound of that handsaw reverberating around the church. Like Franco's great-grandson, he too says it was an honour to be there on that momentous day for Spain. He also says it was emotional. But there, the similarities between the two men's experiences end. For the minister, the emotion came from the thought that there were people watching on their TV screens with tears in their eyes, to finally see the dictator removed to a private family grave. It was an act of democracy, the minister says, of values, of modernity, of a Spain that finally put the dictator in his place. And he denies the exhumation was motivated by the politics of revenge, a charge that's often been made by conservative opposition parties. Back in the cemetery of Mingo Rubio on an autumn day, the sunlight's intense and the visitors keep coming. Francisco's great-grandfather remains a touchstone for far-right supporters, not only in Spain, but globally. Now, many of the dictator's admirers arrive at the cemetery to pay their respects. I ask Francisco how he feels when people come here and make a fascist salute. He says he can't censor anyone from doing anything. I push him a bit. So, is he comfortable with that? No, he says. I'm not very comfortable with it.
Linda Presley. And finally, in our age of mass tourism, travel has, for some, gone from being an adventure of self-discovery to a selfie checklist, as even the most secluded places are now on full display across social media. But there are still ways to immerse yourself in other cultures through less well-trodden routes. Caroline Eden recently embarked on a new adventure of her own on a slow boat across the Black Sea.
Odessa, Constanta, Varna, Trabzon. Over the years, I have visited many Black Sea cities, exploring their different and sometimes connected traditions and cultures. I've eaten mussels and ice cream on Black Sea beaches too, whilst picturing ancient shipwrecks deep below the waves, from Cossack assault vessels to Roman and Venetian ships, all proving centuries of seafaring history. But I'd never been on the Black Sea. That changed this summer when I packed a bag and set off to board a cargo ferry that would take me from the Bulgarian city of Burgas to Batumi in Georgia. 3 nights at sea, being fed whatever the canteen was serving and sleeping in a shared cabin. I could have flown, and probably for less money, but where is the adventure in that? So, at the port of Burgas, on a hot Friday afternoon, I paid €220 and boarded the Druzhba line, or Friendship, as it's known in English. I'd be one of 80, all of us 4 to a cabin. Once on board, Sveti, the passenger captain, handed me my key whilst explaining that she'd worked on ships for 26 years and nowadays spends 6 weeks on the water and 6 weeks off with her all-Bulgarian crew. We spend far more time together than with our own families, she told me with a chuckle. We remained docked as the truckers had their paperwork and vehicles inspected before rolling on. Then, at 3 a.m, a flashlight shone around the cabin door and Ina, a young Ukrainian, introduced herself quietly before taking the bottom bunk. In the morning, with land no longer in sight, I queued for a breakfast of fried eggs, Bulgarian salad, and instant coffee, along with truckers from Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, plus a handful of German backpackers and 2 Czech cyclists, the only other tourists on the ferry, as far as I could tell. As we ate, Ina told me that she was working as a website developer, but to make extra money during the war in Ukraine, she was transporting a car to sell for profit. Hearing so much Russian spoken on board is making me nervous, she whispered to me. After breakfast, the vending machine sprang into action. It could only be operated using tokens paid for in cash to Sveti, because along with chocolate bars and bags of crisps, it also stocked cans of beer and bottles of vodka. The drinking happens today, Sveti revealed. Tomorrow, everyone sobers up before driving on Monday morning. I asked her if she knew the truckers from previous trips. Oh yes, I know all the Georgians, she said. The Kazakhs, though, are newer. Later, one Kazakh truck driver called Yerke Bulan told me that he was delivering a new truck to Shymkent in southern Kazakhstan. A friendly Georgian trucker, who I exchanged some currency with, said he was transporting Italian gourmet goods to sell in the capital, Tbilisi. It was fascinating to find out what was going where. Out on the deck, there was the unmistakable sound and smell of cows mooing and manure. They'd been bought in Austria, a Ukrainian trucker told me, and were being taken to Azerbaijan. He reassured me that as precious live cargo, they were being well looked after, regularly cleaned out and kept cool. Back in the dining room, everyone played backgammon or the Russian card game of Durak or Fool. Wi-Fi at €5 a gigabyte meant more people resorting to analogue forms of entertainment. That night, I politely refused vodka shots from a table of cheery Belarusians who were curious as to why a tourist would be on board at all. But why don't you come to Minsk? They asked. The next day, Sveti took Ina and me to the bridge to meet Captain Chavdar Genchev. He can tell exactly what the weather will do and when, she said proudly. Given the war, is there a risk of sea mines? I asked, and the captain nodded. I have never seen one, but with wind and waves, they can move. He reassured me, though, that there was nothing to worry about. Later, as I sat out on the deck with Ina, there was lightning far in the distance. The captain told us how in winter there could be 10-metre-high waves. But it was hard to imagine such scenes on a calm summer evening, and with the added delight of dolphins swimming alongside the ship. It's a beautiful world, said Ina, far from the air sirens of Kyiv, the city she calls home. And at that moment, it was impossible to disagree.
Caroline Eden. And that's all for today, but you can hear more dispatches from around the world on BBC Sounds. We'll be back again next Saturday morning. Do join us.
After Anthony Easton's father passes away, he goes through his dad's old suitcase. It's filled with cryptic clues, neatly stacked German money, a family tree he doesn't recognise, and also finds his father's birth certificate, but bearing a different name. From BBC Radio 4 and the History Podcast, I'm Charlie Northcote, and I've been working with Anthony Easton to understand his family's dark history and how they lost a fortune worth billions today. What happened to his family, their business empire, and all the money? Listen to The House at Number 48 on BBC Sounds.
I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig from the Global Jigsaw podcast from the BBC, where we explore President Putin's idea of what it is to be Russian. It's packed up in one expression that's become the catchphrase of the moment, the Russian cultural code. We ask, what does it mean? The Global Jigsaw looks at the world through the lens of its media. Find us wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Hello, it's Ray Winstone. I'm here to tell you about my podcast on BBC Radio 4, History's Toughest Heroes. I got stories about the pioneers, the rebels, the outcasts who define tough.
And that was the first time that anybody ever ran a car up that fast with no tires on. It almost feels like your eyeballs are going to come out of your head.
Tough enough for you? Subscribe to History's Toughest Heroes wherever you get your podcast.